Okay, welcome back into Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at Gaza. This camera planted in southern Israel, looking over the Gaza skyline. About 52 minutes past midnight, Israel Standard Time. Let's get the latest on the Middle East with Hal Kempfer. He's a retired Marine intelligence officer and the host of the Strap podcast. He's still standing by with me here. Firstly, let's clarify something for the audience, Hal. There were earlier reports saying that the IDF was moving to a defensive position in Gaza, but I was reading in The Guardian that there continues to be strikes in Gaza. They say that the IDF has continued to strike Palestinian territory, killing 63 people in the last 24 hours. Have you heard the same?
I have, and I'd like to get greater granularity, if you will, or a greater look at what exactly that is. And really what I mean is what was the tactical circumstance where they did that. One of the things that even in a defensive position, you may, gather intelligence, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. You got reporting that comes in that may show that during this time that Hamas is trying to position forces to do some sort of attack or whatever, and that would warrant a strike mission if that was the case. If it's something where Hamas was using this as an opportunity to strike the IDF or to cause harm to civilians or do something else, that would probably warrant what Israel's doing. One thing I should mention is this is not part of a ceasefire. This was a wholly Israeli decision, based on what President Trump asked them to do to stop strike missions. So when they do this, really the only person they have to explain this to, or the only country they have to explain this to, is the United States. And we have a very close relationship with Israel, and I'm sure that within that they have probably established some, rules of engagement, or inform. In this case, it would be more of a informal rules of engagement and what that defensive posture would look like, and they would explain to their U.S. counterparts, who would then pass that on up eventually to the president of the United States to explain what that is. And that's kind of what it is. But there is no ceasefire going on there. There's no ceasefire agreement. What you have right now is just Israel has said we're not going to continue offensive operations, and that's a unilateral thing on their part, which is not something where Hamas can really say much about it. I'm sure they will, but they really can't say anything about it.
Egypt is going to be the next place that we're really looking ahead to. Negotiators are arriving in Egypt for talks on Monday, expected to focus on the release of hostages held by Hamas and then eventually a broader end to the war. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry says that Monday's talks are focusing on the first phase of President Trump's plan to end the war in Gaza. What does the first phase entail, Hal? We just saw a live blast on TV, by the way.
Yeah, I just saw that blast as well. In fact, I just saw another one.
Yep.
Things may be heating up out there. There may be more going on. One of the things is, first off, I just want to point out as a backdrop that you remember President Trump said Sunday to accept it. Well, I will say this: they're playing for time now. Now talk about these talks will go Monday. The U.S. appears to be letting them go into Monday, recognizing that there's a heck of a lot of details that got to get worked out on this thing, to include phase one. Phase one is really about two things. Number one, release the hostages, which includes not just the live hostages, but the remains of those who have deceased. And then the second one is Israel pulling back to really that first line. And they have lines on the map, literally, of how far they will pull back. But it pulls back, out of a lot of Gaza City and some other areas as far as that goes. That's really, I think, all they're planning on accomplishing in phase one. But then, of course, the other part would be they got to look at disarming Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and any other groups aligned with them. They have to do that. And then, of course, in follow-on phases, they got to figure out how they transition this to some sort of peacekeeping force, which could be an Arab peacekeeping force. And once you create, what this will do is it'll kind of create, once Hamas has stepped aside, and you're already starting to see this in large parts of Gaza, it creates a vacuum of leadership, or a vacuum of governance. So they really have to work out what is going to step in and govern. And obviously, they're very far apart. Hamas wants to somehow be part of a future governance thing. The Arab League, European countries, the U.S., others have all said there is no way that they're going to be part of the governance and they're not going to be allowed to remain an armed organization. That's really more phase two, I would think, but I'm sure they're going to have to kind of narrow down what the plan is on that before they even start implementing phase one.
Let's move over to the flotilla story. It's something that we've been tracking closely. If our producer Julie here could remind me the location of this live shot that's coming through right now. It is Portugal, Spain. So, it's Portugal, not Spain. So, I'm hearing that we're seeing the people that were a part of that flotilla, they're returning home after their efforts. The camera's not on some of the, I believe there are some demonstrators here that are a part of this media scrum, if you will. The reason why I show this, Hal, is because I want to ask the question that might be on some people's mind relating to this flotilla. Did it have any tangible impact whatsoever on Gaza?
Zero. Nothing. It didn't get anything in there. And here's the thing. Gaza is an occupied zone. All right. That is, I mean, look, it's not a sovereign state. It doesn't have internationally recognized status, although some countries have said they recognize a Palestinian state. There is no geographic Palestinian state. There is no sovereign state or sovereign national government in the Gaza Strip or anything like that. So it's from an international standpoint, it's Israeli-controlled territory or Israeli controlled territory around, at least around its perimeter. It's always been. And that includes the oceans around it. That is part of Israel's sovereign territorial waters. It's part of Israel's exclusive economic zone. And so when they were going in there, they were going into an area that was controlled by Israel and going up against a lawful naval blockade of that sea space. And they went right into it, and they accomplished nothing. All they did was they got stopped again. And the Israelis boarded the vessels, detained the people that were on the ships, and then the ships were taken off to an Israeli port. They were told to change their course to go to the Israeli port. Of course, that took a little bit more than just telling them to do that to get it up there. But Israel didn't really mess around with it. They brought them in. I think they processed them and said, "Go back to where you came from." And it really was one of those things where almost like protests in the U.S. where, they protest so they can get arrested. And then it's just basically making a statement. That's kind of the maritime version of what you just saw there, was making a statement. But frankly, those ships were so small, they really weren't carrying a lot of material anyway. So even if they had theoretically made it to the shoreline, I have no idea how they thought they were going to get that stuff ashore. But if they made it to the shoreline, that it really would have been, I hate to say it, but a drop in the bucket. In maritime context, sounds pretty bad. But anyway, it really wouldn't have made much difference. And the Israelis told them, said, bring it into the Israeli port. We have ways to get that stuff into the Gaza Strip. But that wasn't the purpose of this. It had nothing to do with getting materials, supplies, needed aid into the Gaza Strip, as more as to just, create this event that obviously is getting a lot of media coverage.
Yep, it sure did. So, Hal, let's talk about where we go from here. And by the way, as we see these blasts, it's not uncommon for us to see blasts in real time on this camera, especially in the overnight hours, Israel Standard Time. I wanted to show you that live vantage point from Portugal just because we had it live at the moment. I want to bounce back to Egypt, though. I want to talk about this important meeting. Is this meeting going to determine what happens next, Hal? Is this what we should have all of our focus on tomorrow?
I think so. I think it is really determining that. And I want to say something about the blast. Okay. Keep in mind, President Trump talked about Sunday was the deadline. All right. Israel agreed to stop offensive operations going up to the deadline. What we might be seeing, I haven't seen a news release on this yet. What we might be seeing is Israel saying, okay, Sunday's over. And certainly, from if you take the time zone difference into effect, yeah, Sunday's over, and so they're saying, look, we are no longer under an obligations to stop offensive operations. They were told to take this agreement. We stopped offensive operations to give them time to do that, and they haven't done it yet. And part of their rationale was to give them time to release the hostages, which they have not done. So part of what you may be seeing is Israel basically turning on the military throttle and doing strike operations in order to put more military pressure on Gaza. And it may be because of what Gaza, the Hamas team or whatever, what they're doing in the negotiations, which assuredly two things. They're trying to buy time, and then they're trying to dismantle whatever's in the 21-point plan. They're trying to dismantle that, so, or to lessen it, or water it down, or however it is, because they're stuck. Basically, this proposal what results in the de facto surrender of Hamas. So that's where the focus of effort is going to be in Egypt. It's going to be trying to work out those details that will basically lead to what this is. And one of the things they're also looking at is the details on the Palestinian population within the Gaza Strip. There's part of it is that there's going to be an opportunity for them to leave the Gaza Strip should they choose to go to another country. The other part is what happens to those who choose not to leave the Gaza Strip. And then the big question is what to do with Hamas. There's been talk of some sort of amnesty deal for Hamas, but within that, I think there's also talk about removing Hamas to a third country or other countries, and I have no idea. There's not a lot of Arab countries that want any of the Hamas members coming in, so I'm not quite sure where the Hamas folks would go. And then, of course, identifying who the Hamas folks are would also be a challenge in and of itself, because they probably wouldn't identify themselves as being Hamas. They'd try to blend in with the local Palestinian population. So there's a lot of details to be worked out on this.
This is live, Hal. President Trump and the First Lady were just in Virginia celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Navy. They've now flown back to Joint Base Andrews. They're deplaning Air Force One and will presumably board Marine One. I'll be curious to see if Trump turns and walks toward the cameras, see if we'll get a Q&A with reporters. I would imagine.
Well, he did a lot of talking in Norfolk.
Right. So I was wondering if we were going to get some reporters yelling questions to President Trump, but it looks like the First Lady and the President are going to board Marine One. They'll fly back over to the White House. Let's ask you about President Trump's role in all of this. As far as Middle East peace goes, he says he wants a truce for what he has said repeatedly is a 3,000-year-long conflict. As we sit here talking about just past 6 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday evening, Hal, what does it feel like the direction of this is all headed? Does it feel like we're heading toward a pretty big peace deal in the Middle East, or does it feel like things are still too unknown to know?
I think it's to some degree unknown, although I would say this is the closest we've ever come to a deal. The other thing is a lot has changed since the previous deals were out there. Militarily, the situation on the ground has changed dramatically. The other thing, too, is on the ground, the Palestinian residents there are just fed up with this war. They're, from what I can tell, they're pretty fed up with Hamas. In fact, one of the things that's popped up is that Israel has been backing some of the other groups, militia type groups, and arming them and helping them as a counter Hamas element operating within Gaza. They just had a rather successful engagement against Hamas when Hamas tried to move them out of an area, and they basically eliminated the Hamas unit that tried to do that. So the dynamics on the ground have changed dramatically. And with that, pretty much what's very interesting to me is President Trump has really become the central deciding figure on what the future of Hamas is going to, or what the future, I'm sorry, of the Gaza Strip is going to look like. Much more so, I think, in some ways than even Bibi Netanyahu, albeit Israel still is where it is, and it is in the situation it is in. But really, if you look at it from an international stage perspective, a global perspective, where the Arab states look at this, where they think this is going, and to a large extent where the body politic of Israel thinks this is going, it really comes down to President Trump. And so he is truly in a decisive role throughout this whole thing. And even though he's not physically in Egypt with the negotiations, although his negotiators are in Egypt working out the details, it really is, in many cases, I think it's going to be what President Trump is willing to accept that comes out of this. It's going to be the biggest deciding factor.
So we know that there will be some American representation at the hostage meeting in Cairo. President Trump is sending envoy Steve Witkoff to attend the meeting. If you had to put yourself in Witkoff's shoes, what's the ultimate goal of the U.S. on Monday in Cairo?
I think the ultimate goal is to get a deal in place, at least phase one. And I think if Witkoff could get phase one, I think if he could turn around to the president and say, look, we've got phase one done, we're going to get the hostages out, that would be a big victory, it'd be a victory for everyone. But if the hostages are out, then that leaves a lot of maneuvering space for Israel to kind of stand down on some of its offensive efforts. And it also puts Hamas in a situation where they have to perform. They can no longer use the hostages for leverage. They're going to have to do whatever they agree to do. And they can't turn around and say, well, we might execute hostages if we don't get our way, that there's no hostages for them to execute. So I think that would be the big thing. And I understand that Jared Kushner is there with them, which I thought was kind of interesting. But Jared Kushner is the architect of the Abraham Accords for the most part. And the fact that he's there makes me wonder if there isn't a sidebar conversation happening about whatever this peace agreement looks like, maybe resulting in another country or two joining the Abraham Accords and normalizing relations with Israel, recognizing Israel as a nation state. And the country that really comes to mind on that is Saudi Arabia.
And there's been some speculation relating to the exact motivation factor for the October 7th attack. Would you agree that there's at least been a lot of discussion out there that it had to do with Saudi-Israeli normalization discussions?
I think there's been some reports that were pretty indicative of that was the whole reason that they really did that Hamas did the October 7th attacks. Was what they saw was the normalization train had kind of left the station with between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That Saudi Arabia was ready to normalize relations with Israel, and for Hamas that would have been just a real blow to their standing, and certainly they felt that they would do something desperate to get back on the map to make themselves relevant. Well, they did, but in the end, it will probably be the end of Hamas as an organization, and probably, I would imagine, the end of Palestinian Islamic Jihad as an organization. And frankly, it may turn out in the end to be the end of Palestinian terrorist organizations, or certainly all the ones that we can think of now. And this, this whole Palestinian resistance movement, if you will, that's been such a big part of the news going back literally to the 1960s.
I got to ask you one final procedural question before we wrap the conversation. So U.S. mediators are going to be in attendance in Cairo. Presumably an Israeli presence will be in Cairo. How does Hamas get represented at these types of meetings?
Well, they have an overseas element. They have their governing side, which actually resides in Doha, and my presumption was that some of the Doha officials flew to Cairo to represent Hamas. Now, I don't know that for a fact. I didn't see the flight itinerary or anything for the Hamas officials, but I believe that some of them are probably in Cairo. But with that said, even if they weren't in Cairo, they have direct communications back to Doha, back to Hamas in Qatar. And so whatever they're discussing, we're doing it through intermediaries. So there is an interlocutor presence there with Qatar and Egypt talking to Hamas. So whatever comes out of that, they have to take a proposal over to Hamas anyway. And it really doesn't matter if Hamas is sitting in the next room or if they're getting it virtually, over in Doha. Either way, they can communicate these things back and forth. It makes for a rather stilted negotiation, as you can well imagine. But all these negotiations with Hamas have been rather stilted because they're a terrorist group. And nobody wants, Israel and the U.S. do not want to be negotiating with terrorists directly if they can avoid it. Although the U.S. has shown some latitude in terms of that position over recent years or year or whatever. But they really don't want to be negotiating with them directly if they can avoid that. So there's a couple of different avenues there, but I would imagine there's some Hamas representation in Cairo. I could be wrong. I haven't heard that clarified, but it doesn't stop them from being able to come up with some sort of negotiated settlement or agreement.
Yeah.
Either way.
Hal is a retired Marine intelligence officer, national security analyst, and host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to Strat anywhere podcasts are available. Good to see you, Hal.
All right. Great to see you, Austin.